All right, let's dive into some philosophy today.
Oh, sounds fun.
We're going to be talking about structured propositions.
Yeah.
You know, those things that could be true or false, like the sky is blue.
Right, right.
Or cats can fly.
Except that one's not true.
Yeah, one of those is definitely not true.
But the interesting thing about propositions, I think, is that they're at the bottom of so much in philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
Like when we talk about logic or language or our beliefs about the world or even what we can know, all of that comes down to propositions.
Right. And like the big question is, what are those things?
Yeah.
We're not just talking about sentences.
No.
Because you could say it's snowing in a bunch of different languages.
Right.
But it's still snowing.
Yeah, the underlying truth is the same.
Right.
That's why we're looking at structured propositions today.
Okay.
And we're going to be taking this from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entries on structured propositions.
Perfect.
Which is the idea that propositions aren't just these kind of blobs of meaning.
Right.
They have structure.
Okay.
Being like, well, Legos.
I love that. Philosophical Legos. Okay,
Yeah.
so how do those Legos work?
Well, we can think about it like this.
So-
Two different people can be the same thing.
Right.
Even if they speak different languages.
Yeah.
So what is that thing that they both believe?
Yeah, that's the proposition.
That's the proposition.
It's not tied to any one language.
Right. It's not the words themselves.
Right, so it's like a blueprint or a design
Yes.
that could be expressed in different ways, but has this core structure that determines what it means.
Precisely.
Okay.
So structured propositions give us a way to break down that blueprint
Okay,
into parts.
gotcha.
So we have the objects involved, like
Yeah.
people and places and things.
Yeah,
And then we have properties and relations that connect them.
okay.
So like Jason loves Patty.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
You have Jason, Patty, and this relation of love that connects them together.
Yeah, and that structure matters.
Yes.
Just
yeah.
as much as the pieces, right?
Just as much as the pieces.
Because you can use the same Legos to make a spaceship or a castle.
Exactly.
So you can have like Jason and Patty and love, but how are they ranged, right?
Yeah, the structure determines what the proposition is.
Right. This reminds me of like a problem I always had with that other view of propositions,
Uh-huh.
that set of possible worlds view.
Oh, yeah.
That a proposition is just the set of all possible worlds in which it's true.
Yeah, that view seems appealing at first.
It does.
But it runs into some problems.
Big problems.
Yeah.
Like how it can't tell the difference between two necessary truths,
Right,
things that are true in every single possible world.
right,
Bachelors are unmarried, and triangles have three sides.
right,
Would be the same proposition.
right.
Because they're both true in all the same worlds,
Yes,
but they're clearly about different things.
they are about different things. And that's where the structured proposition view has an advantage.
Right.
Because they have different parts.
Okay?
And, right, like bachelor, triangle.
Yeah.
So even though they might be true in the same worlds,
Right.
they're still different propositions because they have different parts.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Structured propositions win that round, for sure.
Okay, so,
But what about those tricky, rigid designators?
yes, those are tough.
Those were always hard for me to wrap my head around.
So rigid designators are the terms that always pick out the same things.
Okay.
No matter what world we're talking about, right? So a good example of this is a name.
Okay, Socrates always refers to Socrates.
Always refers to Socrates.
Even if in that world he's a plumber and not a philosopher.
Exactly.
But the problem is that sets of worlds, they just tell you what's true in those worlds.
Right.
They don't capture how that same individual
Yeah.
matters across them.
They don't have a way to represent that same individual across the world.
Right.
But structured propositions have an answer to this. They
Oh.
can just incorporate this idea that names just are the referent.
Okay.
So like Socrates in a proposition literally has Socrates as a part of its structure.
So it's like the name is directly plugged into the proposition.
Yeah,
No descriptive middleman needed.
you got it.
I love that.
So before we get into the different types of structured propositions, there's this other problem that any theory of propositions has to address.
Oh, what's the catch?
It's the problem of false propositions.
Okay.
So if a proposition is just these objects and relations arranged in a certain way,
Right.
what happens if that arrangement doesn't actually hold in the real world?
Yeah.
Like, does the proposition just, poof, stop existing?
That's a great question.
Yeah, like, do false thoughts exist?
Yeah.
That's a very philosophical question.
This is where things get really philosophical.
Yes, and there are a lot of interesting answers to this problem.
Okay.
But one that's been put forward by Edward Salta
Okay.
is that even if, say, Ed isn't running, the proposition Ed runs still exists.
Yeah.
It's just false.
So it's like a blueprint for a building that was never built.
Yes.
It's
But there, it's just not a blueprint for anything real.
Right.
So truth on his view
Yeah.
is a separate matter from whether the proposition exists or not.
Okay, so we've done from simple sentences to this, like, intricate world of structured propositions,
Yeah,
and it seems like there's a lot more to unpack here.
definitely.
What stands out to you as, like, the most intriguing aspect of all of this?
I think what's really interesting is that there isn't just one right answer to what a proposition is.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we have all these competing theories, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, really shows just how deep this question goes.
It's like we're peeking behind the curtain of language and thought
Yes.
and trying to figure out what the machinery is that makes it all work.
Exactly. And the structured proposition theory, even though it's complicated,
Yeah.
it gives us a really powerful framework for understanding how meaning is built,
Yeah.
how we represent the world,
Mm-hmm.
and even what it means for something to be true or false.
Okay, so to our listener, don't worry.
Yeah.
We're going to break down all those different flavors of structured proposition.
Right, like Neo-Russellian,
Yeah, structured intentions.
algebraic.
And we're going to explore how they tackle all of these mind-boggling issues.
But first,
Yeah.
we need to take a closer look at how structured propositions deal with this whole direct reference thing.
Yeah.
It says things get really interesting when we start thinking about what it means to believe something when names are involved.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, so we've talked about how structured propositions might be a good way to think about how we represent the world.
Yeah,
But how does that work with names and beliefs?
yeah.
Because it seems pretty intuitive that, like, I can know who Mark Twain is
Mm-hmm.
without knowing that he's the same person as Samuel Clemens.
Right.
So how does that work with structured propositions?
Yeah, this gets at the heart of what's so interesting about this direct reference view,
Okay.
where a name just is the thing that it refers to.
Right.
So if Mark Twain in a proposition literally contains Mark Twain as part of its structure, does that mean that if I believe one thing about him, I
Yeah.
automatically believe the same thing if we just swap in the name Samuel Clemens?
Right. It feels like there should be room for me to have different beliefs about someone,
Yeah,
depending on, like, what name I'm thinking about them under,
yeah,
even if it turns out to be the same guy.
absolutely.
So how do we square that?
So this is the problem that philosophers who defend this view,
Okay.
which is sometimes called the Neo-Russellian view of structured propositions.
Right.
People like Scott Soames and Nathan Saman, they've had to wrestle with this.
Okay, so what do they say?
Well, their argument is subtle.
Okay.
They say, yes, the propositions themselves might be identical
Okay.
if the names refer to the same guy.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that we grasp those propositions, the way that we access them, can be different.
Okay, so it's like I could learn something new from Mark Twain as Samuel Clemens
Right.
if I didn't know that was the case.
Exactly.
But once I learn that, then it just becomes like Samuel Clemens is Samuel Clemens, which isn't interesting at all.
Exactly. It's no longer informative.
Right.
The information that's conveyed by a proposition
Okay.
or the ability for you to learn something new from it
Yeah.
really depends on what you already know about the names involved.
But hold on. Wouldn't this mean that, like, logically,
Yeah.
I should have all the same beliefs of someone,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of what name I'm using, as soon as I know that it's the same person?
Yeah.
That seems too strong.
You're getting on a really key point of contention here.
Okay.
And this gets into this whole debate about the cognitive significance of different presentations of information.
Okay.
So even if, like, at a deep level, the propositions are the same,
Yeah.
the way we think about them, the way we, the mental paths we take,
Right.
those can differ based on how the information is packaged for it.
So direct reference might be elegant in theory,
Mm-hmm.
but it gets messy when you try to map it onto how we actually think.
Exact.
Case in point, these false propositions.
Yes.
Even if structured propositions solve some problems,
Right.
this is still a real head scratch.
This is a problem for any theory of propositions.
Yeah, because if the proposition is just those pieces fitted together,
Mm-hmm.
what happens if the way they're fitted together doesn't match up with reality?
Yeah.
Like, does the thought just blink out of existence because it's wrong?
Right.
It feels like false beliefs should exist somehow,
You're not alone.
even if they're false.
Lots of philosophers agree with you on that one.
Okay.
Remember Edward Zalta?
Yeah.
His solution to this?
Right. He says they still exist.
They still exist, they're just false.
It's like that blueprint for a building that was never built.
Exactly.
It's still there.
The blueprint is there, but it doesn't correspond to anything real.
It's just not a blueprint for anything.
Right.
So he really separates the existence of the proposition
Yes.
from whether or not it's true,
It can be well-formed, structured, the whole 9 yards,
Yeah.
and still be wrong.
which then makes you wonder what makes it false.
Yes.
Like, what are we comparing it to?
Right. This gets at the heart of different theories of truth.
Okay.
Right. So some people think that we compare propositions to states of affairs out in the world.
Okay.
Other people think it has more to do with whether a proposition coheres with the rest of your beliefs.
Okay.
That's a whole other debate.
Yeah, so we have structured propositions, which give us a way to think about the structure of these things that
Mhm.
could be true or false.
Right.
But then we have this other level of figuring out how they line up with reality or not.
Yes, that's a big question.
And that's where things get really complicated.
Yes, and that's just one rabbit hole we could go down.
Right, we could go down that one forever.
But remember, there are other approaches to structured propositions as well.
Right, the Stanford Encyclopedia mentioned a couple of others, like structured intensions and the algebraic approach.
Right, so we should talk about those.
Yeah, let's get those out there.
Just so our listener has a bigger picture.
Yeah, so what's the deal with structured intentions?
Okay, so structured intentions gets a bit more technical.
Oh, boy.
But it's worth talking about.
Okay.
It's similar to the Neo-Russellian view.
Okay.
But instead of just plugging in the individuals themselves as parts of the propositions,
Right.
focuses on the intention of the terms.
Okay, remind me what an intention is.
So an intention you can think of as like the meaning of a term across possible worlds.
Okay.
So it's a function that takes a world as input and spits out what that term refers to in that world.
Okay.
So the intention of the president is going to pick out different people in different worlds.
Right.
But the intention itself is this consistent meaning.
Right, okay.
So the structured intentions view says the parts of a proposition
Okay.
aren't the individuals directly,
Yeah?
but it's these more abstract intentions.
Oh, okay.
And this allows you to draw some more fine-grained distinctions between propositions.
Okay.
Even if they might involve the same individuals in the actual world. So it gives you more nuance.
Okay, I like nuance.
And then there's the algebraic approach.
Okay, that one sounds intriguing.
This one is all about building up propositions from simpler parts using logical functions.
Oh, okay.
And the big proponent of this view is Edward Zalta,
Oh, our friend.
the guy who thinks that false propositions still exist.
So instead of Legos, we're talking about propositional equations.
Kind of.
Okay.
So he uses like these functions like pplug, which takes a relation and an individual,
Okay.
and it creates a proposition by plugging that individual into the relation. So
Right.
like plug runs Ed would give you the proposition Ed runs.
So it's like this formal way of constructing the proposition itself.
Exactly.
From the pieces.
Piece by piece.
Okay.
And this gives him a way to distinguish between propositions that
Okay.
are necessarily equivalent,
Right.
but still have different structures.
So all bachelors are unmarried and all brothers are male siblings.
Right. Those would be built up differently using these functions.
Okay.
Even though they might be true in all the same worlds.
Right. So you can really see how those propositions are different.
Yeah, I do.
Even if they happen to have the same truth value.
It lets you look under the hood.
Yeah, like.
See the gears turning.
But wouldn't that run into that same problem of false propositions?
Good point.
If it's just functions and plugging things in?
Yeah.
What happens when what comes out the other side doesn't actually match reality?
Yeah, you're catching on.
The try.
So this is where Zalta's view that propositions can exist even if they're false becomes really important.
Yeah, he needs that.
He needs that for this to work.
For his whole system to work.
Yes.
So it's like he's built this elaborate machine that could crank out true propositions and false ones.
No problem.
No problem. It can make both.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
And that's part of what makes his view so interesting.
Okay, so we have Neo-Russellian structured intentions, the algebraic approach.
Yeah.
Are there any other contenders our listeners should know about?
There's one more that's worth mentioning. It
Yeah.
takes a totally different approach.
Okay.
Instead of focusing on these static structures,
Right.
it emphasizes the actions involved in creating and grasping propositions.
Oh, a more dynamic view.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So this is where philosophers like Jeffrey C. King and Peter Hanks come in.
Okay.
They say propositions aren't just these disembodied structures. They're really tied to the mental acts of thinking agents.
Oh, okay, so instead of Legos, it's like we're building them in real time.
Yeah, in the act of thinking.
Through the act of thinking.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
So for King, the key idea here is this notion of predication.
Okay.
So when we think or judge or assert something,
Mm-hmm.
we're predicating a property of an object.
So like when I think that cloud looks like a bunny,
Yeah,
I'm predicating the property of looking like a bunny
right.
to that particular
To that cloud, exactly.
Okay.
And King's view is that it's this act of predication
Okay.
that gives a proposition its truth conditions.
So it's not that the proposition just exists independently
Right.
and then it just happens to be true or false?
No, it's the act of predicating
Okay.
that makes it.
So truth, in a sense, emerges from our actively engaging with the world
Yeah,
and trying to represent it and make judgments about it.
that's the idea.
Okay.
And Hanks builds on this idea.
Okay.
He really emphasizes that predication is assertive.
Okay.
It's committing. So when we predicate a property of an object,
Yeah.
we're not just passively describing. We're making a claim about how things are.
Yeah.
We're putting our necks out there.
Yeah, it's a commitment.
It's a commitment.
So propositions on this view are less like descriptions
Right.
and more like
Sure.
judgments about the world.
Yeah, judgments about the world.
And it's that act of committing
Yeah,
that explains how they can be true or false.
exactly.
So this action-based view really changes things up.
It does.
It challenges that idea of propositions as like these abstract mind-independent entities,
Yeah.
and it grounds them in our cognitive lives,
Right.
in the ways that we perceive and think and interact with the world.
Exactly.
So, okay, so we have structured propositions that are like blueprints.
Uh-huh.
We have propositions built from logical functions.
Yeah.
And now we have propositions that are like created through our acts of thinking.
Right.
My head is spinning a little.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But I think it's really cool that
Yeah.
these philosophical questions can lead us down so many different paths,
Mm-hmm.
each with its own insights
Yeah.
and challenges.
And it shows how much is at stake when we talk about something as seemingly simple as a proposition.
Absolutely.
We're really talking about the nature of meaning,
Yes.
truth, belief,
Mhm.
the very foundations of our ability to even think and talk about the world.
It's really fundamental.
Yeah, it's like we zoomed in from sentences and beliefs to like this microscopic level of how we actually represent the world.
And this action-based view,
Yeah.
it sounds radical,
Yeah.
but it has some interesting implications for these problems we've been talking about.
Oh, okay, like what? How does it deal with those tricky false propositions?
Well, if a proposition is tied to an act of judgment,
Okay,
then a false proposition is just one where that act of judgment doesn't quite line up with reality.
okay.
It's not that the proposition disappears.
Yep.
It's that the act of predication was, misguided.
So it's not about the proposition vanishing. It's about like our mental act kind of failing
Yeah.
to capture the world.
Yeah, it's like aiming an arrow and missing the target.
Okay,
The arrow still exists, but it didn't hit its mark.
I like that.
And it helps to address another worry we had about those more static views of structured propositions.
Oh, okay.
Remember how we were concerned that if a name just is its referent,
Yeah.
then believing one thing about Mark Twain means believing the same thing about Samuel Clemens.
Right, right. It felt too strong.
Yeah, too strong.
Didn't leave enough room for like genuine differences in belief
Right,
based on how you're thinking about someone,
exactly.
even if it's the same person.
So the action-based view kind of gives us a way out of that.
Oh, okay.
It says it's not just about those names being lugged into the proposition.
Okay.
It's about the act of using those names, the act of predicating something of the person you're thinking about.
So I could have different beliefs about Mark Twain versus Samuel Clemens
Right.
if my act of judging them is different,
Exactly.
even if they're the same person.
It's not just about the structure of the proposition, but about the cognitive act
Yeah.
that brings that structure to life.
That makes sense.
And those acts can be sensitive to, like, the way you're thinking about the person.
Yeah.
The information you have access to, all of that.
So this action-based view has a whole other layer,
It does.
but it also seems to offer more flexibility
It does.
for how beliefs actually work.
It really does.
Yeah, we're moving from static blueprints to like
Yes.
these dynamic mental processes.
Yeah, a much more dynamic picture.
And that raises some other questions.
What kind of questions?
Well, like if propositions are tied to these acts of judgment,
Yeah.
does that mean that they're constantly changing,
Yeah, good question.
fleeting?
How can we have stable belief if the propositions that our beliefs are about are always changing?
Right. It feels like beliefs should have some staying power.
Yeah, beliefs should stick around.
They shouldn't just dissolve when I stop thinking about them.
So this is where King and Tanks, they
Okay.
make this distinction between
Yeah.
propositional tokens and propositional types.
Okay, now we're getting into the philosophy jargon.
Here we go.
What's the difference?
So think about it like this.
Okay.
Every time I think Socrates is wise, I'm creating a new propositional token.
Okay.
So that's one specific instance of that thought.
Okay.
But all those tokens, every time I think that thought,
Yeah.
they all share a common propositional type,
Okay.
which is like the underlying structure and meaning.
So the tokens are like individual bubbles in a glass of champagne,
I love it.
but they all share that bubbly champagne essence.
Yes, and it's the type that serves as the object of belief
Okay.
and knowledge and so on.
So while the tokens are coming and going,
Right, they're fleeting.
the type is what gives us that stable, unchanging content.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
So it's like the type is the blueprint,
yeah.
and each token is just one way that blueprint can be realized
Okay, I like that.
in your mind.
Cool. So after exploring all these different approaches to structured propositions,
Yeah.
from neo-Russellian to action-based,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listener?
For a philosopher, I think the most important takeaway is that these theories show just how deep the connections are
Okay.
between language, thought, and metaphysics.
Yeah.
We're not just messing around with formal systems here.
All right.
We're dealing with really big questions
Yeah.
about the nature of representation, truth, the relationship between our minds and the world.
It's like we took this familiar concept,
Yeah,
the proposition,
the
and we
proposition.
zoomed in to see all this machinery underneath.
And what's really wild is that there's still so much we don't know.
Oh, I'm sure.
Like, do these structures that we've been talking about mirror something in the brain itself?
Right.
How do these theories explain how we reason and make inferences?
Yeah.
What does this all mean for AI?
So many questions.
So many questions.
Not enough time.
But I think this deep dive has given our listener plenty to think about.
Especially a philosophical listener.
Yeah, especially a philosophical listener.
We've gone from these simple sentences to these super intricate theories of meaning.
We've explored all these different views: Neo-Russellian propositions, structured intentions, the algebraic approach,
Yeah.
action-based views.
And we've seen how they challenge us to think more deeply about the stuff we thought we understood.
Yeah, they really push us to re-examine our basic assumptions about language and thought.
And through it all, we've seen that there are still these profound mysteries
Yeah,
at the heart of language and thought and reality.
absolutely.
So to our listener out there, if you're feeling curious,
Yeah.
keep digging into these theories.
Yeah, explore the literature.
Maybe even come up with your own view on these philosophical puzzles.
Yeah, because trying to understand propositions
Yeah.
is an ongoing journey.
It is.
And it takes us right to the heart of what it means to be a thinking, meaning-making person
In a very confusing world.
in a confusing world.
So keep questioning.
Keep exploring.
Keep those philosophical gears turning.
Until next time.
Happy
Hey.
philosophizing.